Further on, there are bananas, carrots, beans, and potatoes, monkey skulls, and chickens.
Andrew McCarthy was everywhere. Movie posters, magazine covers, right at the heart of a cultural moment that defined a whole generation. To the outside world, it looked like nonstop opportunity and glamour. But behind the scenes, McCarthy was experiencing something very different. Years later, he's finally opening up about that time. And the reality isn't what most people expect. What should have been a launchpad for his career slowly became a weight he couldn't shake. The irony is impossible to miss. One of the most recognizable faces of the 1980s felt trapped by the fame that made him famous. This isn't just a story about the past. It's about how one moment can follow you for a lifetime. And why Andrew McCarthy's truth feels far more tragic than anyone ever realized. The curse behind the Brat Pack. Andrew McCarthy grew up in Westfield, New Jersey, one of 4 brothers, in a regular suburban household that gave no early hint of Hollywood fame. But everything changed after a school production of Oliver. The moment he stepped on stage, something clicked. Acting stopped being a hobby and became the goal. From there on out, he was locked in. He knew if he was serious, New York City was the place to be. At the time, he described the city as rough around the edges, loud, dirty, and electric all at once. That energy pulled him in. Even though his grades were nothing special, he managed to get into NYU with one clear warning attached. He had to keep a B average. During his freshman year, a friend spotted a casting notice in Backstage magazine. They were looking for an 18-year-old prep school student who was smart but deeply insecure. It sounded close enough to real life, so Andrew jumped on the subway and headed to the Ansonia Hotel on the Upper West Side for the open call. The casting team liked him right away, enough to bring him back for a taped audition, which was cutting-edge tech at the time. But Andrew was convinced he blew it. Watching himself on camera, he felt stiff and unsure. When he walked out, he was sure his shot at acting had ended before it even started. Then fate stepped in, disguised as a technical problem. Weeks later, the filmmakers were in Los Angeles reviewing audition tapes. When Andrew's tape came up, the director wanted to skip it. Problem was, no one knew how to fast forward. They had no choice but to watch the whole thing. Somewhere in that forced viewing, a producer noticed something familiar in him, an intensity that reminded him of Anthony Perkins. That observation changed everything. Andrew was called back and given another chance. This time, he nailed it. That second look landed him the lead role in the 1983 film Class, and just like that, his career was moving. Class marked Andrew McCarthy's big screen debut, alongside Jacqueline Bisset and a young Rob Lowe. For a first film, it was a huge opportunity. He played Jonathan Ogner, a prep school kid who ends up rooming with Lowe's character, Skip. Skip immediately messes with him, tricking Jonathan into thinking seniors are supposed to roam campus in girls' underwear. It is brutal, embarrassing hazing, but Jonathan eventually gets even, and the two become friends. Things take a sharp turn when they leave campus. Jonathan begins an affair with an older woman, only to discover during a holiday break that she is Skip's mother. It is awkward, messy, and bold storytelling. Honestly, it is the kind of plot that would struggle to get made today. Still, Andrew handled it beautifully, balancing humor and discomfort with real emotional weight. Right out of the gate, he proved he could do more than just look the part. That role should have launched him straight upward. Instead, things slipped. His grades dropped, and by his second year, NYU showed him the door. What followed was a long, quiet stretch. More than a year passed without a single acting job. He spent most of that time alone in his small West Village walk-up, waiting for a phone call that never came. Eventually, he landed a Burger King commercial. His co-star was an unknown actress named Elizabeth Shue, just before she broke out in The Karate Kid. Andrew was instantly drawn to her. After the shoot, he asked her to grab a drink at his favorite spot, the Corner Bistro. Years later, he would describe her as a bright, hopeful presence, someone who patiently tolerated his sarcasm and the packed bar scene. And then, just like that, she disappeared from his life. He never saw her again. But as one door closed, another opened wide. Andrew got a call from director Joel Schumacher, who wanted him for a new coming-of-age drama called St. Elmo's Fire. The cast read like a future Hall of Fame for young Hollywood. Rob Lowe, Demi Moore, Judd Nelson, and Emilio Estevez. With that role, Andrew McCarthy officially stepped into what the media would soon label the Brat Pack. In St. Elmo's Fire, he played Kevin Dolans, part of a tight-knit group of recent college grads struggling to figure out adulthood. The movie lives in that uncomfortable in-between space, where friendships are still strong, but life is pulling everyone in different directions. You can feel the tension as the characters grow, change, and slowly drift. The message lands in the final moments. Kevin and Alec make peace, but instead of returning to their old hangout, they choose somewhere new. It is a quiet but powerful signal that their friendship is evolving beyond the safety of college life. When the film came out in 1985, critics were lukewarm, but culturally, it hit hard. Andrew was now firmly associated with the Brat Pack, a label that sounds nostalgic today, but started as a jab. You see, in May of 1985, being a young actor in Hollywood felt like winning the lottery. If you were in your late teens or early 20s, the timing could not have been better. Directors like John Hughes were finally treating teenage life as something worth taking seriously, making films that actually spoke to the kids watching them. Studios caught on fast. The 14 to 24 audience had money, influence, and loyalty, and Hollywood wanted all of it. For actors in that age range, the work was steady, and the future looked wide open. At the same time, ensemble films were having a major moment. The Breakfast Club had just hit theaters that February and instantly became a cultural reset. It showed how powerful a group of young actors could be when placed in the same story. So by the time summer rolled around, all eyes were on the next big release, St. Elmo's Fire. The cast alone made it feel like an event. It brought together familiar faces from The Breakfast Club, leads from Class, and a rising television star who many believed was about to become the next big thing. With a movie centered on the emotional highs and lows of being a 20-something set to drop in June, the mood felt electric. It seemed like the start of something legendary. What made it even sweeter was that no one was riding that wave alone. These actors were moving as a group. They were ambitious, serious about their craft, and young enough to enjoy every perk that came with sudden fame. In that moment, it genuinely felt like the world was theirs. Then June 10th, 1985 arrived, and everything shifted. New York Magazine released a cover story featuring many of those same rising stars, and it was anything but flattering. The article painted them as spoiled, overpaid, and self-indulgent. Instead of hungry artists, they were framed as party-focused celebrities who cared more about nightlife than their work. To make matters worse, the writer, David Bloom, gave the group a nickname that would never go away. He called them the Brat Pack. What makes it even stranger is that the article was never meant to be about a group at all. Bloom originally set out to profile Emilio Estevez, But when Estevez invited him out for a night at the Hard Rock Cafe with friends like Rob Lowe and Judd Nelson, Blum saw something bigger. He saw access to a privileged, fast-moving world, and decided that was the real story. In the piece, Blum positioned these young actors as the 1980s version of the Brat Pack, a roaming crew of famous faces chasing parties, attention, and pleasure. He even drew direct comparisons to legends like Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin, pointing out that, like the Rat Pack before them, these actors often worked together and carried their real-life friendships onto the screen. On paper, they had it all. Big contracts, limousines, powerful agents, publicists protecting their images, fans who followed them everywhere and picked up the tab. And above all, they sold tickets. At first, the nickname sounded clever, memorable, almost flattering. But it did not take long for it to turn sour. What felt like branding quickly became a label, and then a liability. Andrew was barely mentioned, and one anonymous quote brushed him off completely, suggesting he wouldn't last. In his documentary, Brats, he remembers seeing the cover and instantly knowing it spelled trouble. He could feel it right away. Something had gone wrong. The article took shots at an entire generation of young actors, but the name was so catchy it stuck. And once it did, there was no shaking it. Ironically, Andrew was never that close to the group he was lumped into. Still, he leaned into the lifestyle that came with sudden fame. He had been drinking and smoking casually since high school, but things escalated during this period. When filming St. Elmo's Fire began, a producer gifted him a bottle of red wine. Andrew took it back to New York and opened it alone one night. He later said that moment marked the first time he drank by himself. It seemed small at the time, but it quietly kicked off a long battle with substance abuse, one that would follow him for years to come. Andrew McCarthy's dark double life. With his bright blue eyes and soft, boyish face, Andrew McCarthy looked like the definition of safe. He had the kind of appearance that screamed, "Boy next door," the guy you would proudly introduce to your parents. But while the image sold tickets, the reality was much darker. Behind the scenes of his 1980s rise, McCarthy was living a split existence, drifting deeper into a world of cocaine, strip clubs, and reckless nights that nearly cost him his health. What made it even more ironic was that, despite his fame, romance never came easily. He crushed on plenty of well-known actresses, but most barely noticed him. For someone constantly cast as the sensitive heartthrob, real-life confidence was hard to come by. That all shifted in 1986 during auditions for Pretty in Pink. The role of Blaine was originally envisioned as a traditional athlete type, and when McCarthy read for the part, the room barely reacted. He left assuming it went nowhere. But the moment he stepped outside, Molly Ringwald spoke up. She told John Hughes that McCarthy felt like the kind of guy she would actually fall for. Hughes was surprised and skeptical, but Ringwald stood her ground. That instinct changed the casting and quietly reshaped McCarthy's career. Even after landing the role, the experience was far from smooth. McCarthy later admitted that he never truly connected with Ringwald or Hughes. He described Hughes as distant and guarded, not the warm presence fans might expect. His relationship with John Cryer was no better. Cryer's anxious energy and constant nervous laughter rubbed McCarthy the wrong way, and the two never found common ground. Pretty in Pink drops viewers straight into the pressure cooker of high school life in Chicago, right at that moment when graduation is close and emotions feel unbearable. At the center is Andy Walsh, played by Ringwald, and her loyal but eccentric best friend, Ducky. They sit firmly outside the school's social elite, largely because they do not come from money. Andy's father is working class and struggling, doing his best but barely staying afloat. That alone makes Andy a target. She avoids the wealthy crowd whenever possible, until she crosses paths with Blaine McDonough at the senior prom. Blaine is instantly drawn to her, and McCarthy plays him with a quiet decency that makes him easy to root for. He is aware of his privilege, but he is not cruel or dismissive. He simply likes Andy for who she is. The film leans heavily into the class divide running through the school. Rich kids stay with rich kids. Working class kids stay in their lane. Blaine becomes an exception, and that choice costs him. When he meets Ducky, the tension is immediate. Ducky is defensive and hostile, protective of Andy, and secretly in love with her. Blaine, caught off guard, seems genuinely confused by the aggression. He does not see himself as a threat. That innocence sets him apart from many other Hughes characters. At its core, the story mirrors a classic forbidden romance. Two people from opposite worlds trying to make something real despite the pressure around them. What gives the film weight is how clearly it shows the cost on both sides. Andy's insecurity feels grounded and raw. Blaine's dilemma is quieter, but just as painful. His friends make it clear that choosing Andy means losing them. McCarthy sells that conflict, showing a young man forced to decide between loyalty and love before he is ready for either. Ironically, McCarthy hated the script at first. He thought the story was ridiculous and actively looked for a way out. But he needed the job, and staying turned out to be the right call. His performance became one of the film's strongest elements. Off-camera, tensions only grew. McCarthy found Cryer needy and exhausting. Things with Ringwald were even more complicated. According to director Howard Deutsch, the two disliked each other intensely. The issue stemmed from unbalanced feelings. Ringwald had a strong crush on McCarthy, and when it was not returned, resentment built. Deutsch stepped in, even lying to Ringwald to keep the peace, telling her McCarthy felt the same, but was too shy to admit it. That awkwardness ended up working in the film's favor. Deutsch leaned into it, allowing real discomfort to translate into believable romantic tension. The uncertainty felt authentic because it was. Whether the actors realized it or not, the conflict helped elevate the performances. By the time Pretty in Pink wrapped, McCarthy was fully immersed in Hollywood excess. He was staying at the Chateau Marmont, partying at famous homes, and brushing shoulders with legends. At one hotel party, he tried chatting up a young woman with a short pixie haircut. She was unimpressed. That woman was Courtney Cox. Later, after a night out introduced by co-star James Spader, McCarthy grew closer to a stripper named Glitter. After spending the night with her, he went straight to set the next morning. Mid-scene, filming stopped. The cinematographer noticed strange specks on McCarthy's face. On closer inspection, it became clear that Glitter had quite literally left her mark all over his clean-cut image. When the movie premiered, McCarthy did not feel victorious. In his memoir, he describes the night as an escape. Dressed awkwardly in a black blazer and skinny tie, he wandered Hollywood Boulevard looking for somewhere to disappear. He slipped into a hamburger hamlet, bypassed the crowd, and sat alone at the bar. The image says a lot. Anxious, isolated, unsure of his place, even at the height of success. He was never the kind of actor who thrived on attention or worked a room with ease. Despite all of that, Pretty in Pink was a major hit. It earned over $40 million and finished as one of the top-grossing films of the year. Some critics were growing tired of high school dramas, but they still praised the sharp writing and emotional pull. Even the harshest reviews admitted that this cast brought new life to a familiar story. proving once again that behind the glossy surface, something real was happening. Success that came at a cost. Pretty in Pink was such a success that it opened another door almost immediately. John Hughes personally invited Andrew McCarthy to star in his next film, Some Kind of Wonderful. But McCarthy did not connect with the role and turned it down. According to his memoir, that decision ended their relationship on the spot. Hughes never called again, and the silence was permanent. By the time McCarthy moved into production on Mannequin in 1987, his personal life was unraveling. He was drinking nearly every day and using cocaine heavily. The darker irony is that this chaotic headspace seemed to fuel his performances. There was a strange chemistry between his frantic energy and the kind of offbeat roles he was landing at the time, especially when those roles involved talking to things that barely talked back. Mannequin is pure 1980s fantasy, equal parts rom-com, neon dream, and bizarre wish fulfillment. The story is as strange as they come. A woman in ancient Egypt tries to escape an arranged marriage and prays to the gods, only to be transformed into a mannequin centuries later. That mannequin ends up in the hands of Jonathan, a struggling artist played by McCarthy, who painstakingly creates it. After losing his job, Jonathan drifts from one failure to another until he spots the mannequin displayed in a department store window. From that moment on, his entire mission becomes getting hired at that store just to be near it again. And this is before the mannequin even comes to life at night as Kim Cattrall, visible only to him. What makes it truly unhinged is that Jonathan is already deeply attached to this fiberglass figure. He is emotionally invested, protective, and clearly obsessed. It raises serious questions about how the script ever got approved and what kind of atmosphere existed in the writer's room. Fittingly, the film came from Cannon Films, a studio famous for backing some of the strangest projects of the decade. For years, critics argued that female characters in 80s films were often treated like objects. Mannequin did not just lean into that idea, it built an entire movie around it. Kim Cattrall is largely there to be admired, while McCarthy spends a good chunk of the runtime acting opposite an inanimate stand-in. And yet, somehow, it works. Critics tore the film apart when it was released, dismissing it as ridiculous fluff. For a long time, the only thing anyone remembered was the massive hit song, "Nothing's Gonna Stop Us Now." But with time, Mannequin found its audience. Viewers became more willing to embrace its silliness, its exaggerated performances, and its unapologetic weirdness. James Spader, in particular, goes all in as a scenery-chewing villain. A big reason the movie holds together is McCarthy himself. He brings a nervous, offbeat charm that makes Jonathan oddly likable. The comedy largely comes from the people around him reacting to his increasingly intense relationship with a mannequin. They are unsettled, confused, and slightly alarmed, but they tolerate it because he keeps delivering brilliant ideas that save the store. Between the candy-colored visuals, eccentric characters, and endlessly upbeat soundtrack, Mannequin ultimately lands as a feel-good crowd pleaser. Behind the scenes, though, McCarthy was barely holding on. Writing about his experience on Less Than Zero, he describes how close his cocaine use came to killing him. In one moment, he took a hit right before filming a scene that required him to dive into a pool. The shock of the cold water caused his chest to seize so violently that he feared his heart was failing. Not long after, he went on a drug-soaked road trip across the country with two friends. It was a bleak blur of hotel bars, heavy drinking, and escalating chaos that nearly ended in a violent confrontation in Colorado. The moment that snapped everything into focus happened in Missouri. A police car pulled them over, and the sudden stop sent a pile of cocaine flying across the back seat. Panicking, McCarthy tried to snort as much of it as he could before the officer reached the window. As the flashlight swept across his face, he sat there pretending to be half asleep, while his heart pounded uncontrollably. By then, he knew alcohol had stopped being a casual habit and had taken full control of his life. Just before filming the 1989 comedy Weekend at Bernie's, he made a drastic choice. He quit cold turkey. To stay sober, he withdrew completely, cutting himself off from parties, nightlife, and nearly everyone around him. That decision came right at the tail end of the 1980s, a decade defined by excess, ambition, and glossy indulgence. Weekend at Bernie's fits squarely into that world. The film follows two young professionals who are invited to their boss's luxurious beach house for the weekend. The problem is that their boss is corrupt, dangerous, and very dead before the weekend even begins. Andrew McCarthy stars alongside Jonathan Silverman as Larry Wilson, one half of the unlucky duo. After uncovering a major financial mistake, Larry and his friend Richard report it to their CEO, Bernie Lomax. Bernie pretends to be grateful and invites them to celebrate at his Hamptons home. In reality, Bernie is behind the fraud and plans to have them killed. Before he can follow through, the mob murders Bernie instead, staging it as an overdose. When Larry and Richard arrive at the house, they discover his body just as guests begin flooding in. With no time to explain, they do the unthinkable. They prop him up and spend the entire weekend pretending Bernie is alive, dragging his corpse through parties, beaches, and business deals. The plan spirals into increasingly absurd territory until the assassin returns, forcing Larry into a final scuffle that ends with police intervention. The premise is outrageous, morbid, and borderline tasteless. Yet, against all odds, it worked. Weekend at Bernie's was only a moderate box office success when it premiered in the summer of 1989. But over time, through home video and endless cable reruns, it found a devoted audience. The film's pitch-black humor, paired with its sunny, carefree tone, felt unlike anything else. What once seemed ridiculous eventually revealed itself as strangely original, securing the movie a lasting place as a true cult classic. When stardom stopped saving him. As the 1980s gave way to the 1990s, Andrew McCarthy slowly slipped out of the spotlight. He was no longer everywhere at once, no longer the face of a generation of coming-of-age films. But this was not a quiet fade into obscurity. Behind the scenes, his life was unraveling. While filming Jours Tranquilles à Clichy in 1990, a co-star casually offered him a beer. When McCarthy lifted the can, his hands began to shake. In that instant, he knew exactly what he was doing. He later described it as lighting a match next to kerosene. What followed were 3 years he now remembers as painful, chaotic, and largely lost. The breaking point came one morning at home. He woke up violently hungover, his body convulsing. He barely made it to the bathroom before collapsing to his knees. Sitting there, crying, he finally confronted the reality he had been avoiding. By age 29, there was no denying that alcohol had taken control of his life. He could no longer pretend otherwise. Letting go brought relief, but it also stripped away his shield. Without substances, he was forced to face the fears and insecurities he had been running from for years. In 1992, at 29 years old, McCarthy checked into rehab. That decision marked the start of a sober life, one he has maintained every day since. Professionally, the 1990s were far less kind. McCarthy continued working, but most of his projects during this period failed to connect with audiences or critics. He returned for Weekend at Bernie's too in 1993, but the sequel lacked the charm and surprise of the original. Released 4 years after the first film, it felt disconnected from the moment that had made the franchise work. By then, McCarthy's star power had cooled noticeably. His co-star, Jonathan Silverman, was also struggling, releasing the time loop film 1201 the same year Groundhog Day dominated pop culture. It was a brutal case of terrible timing. The chemistry that once carried Weekend at Bernie's never quite resurfaced, and the script did them no favors. Original writer Robert Klein took over as director, but the film landed flat. Critics were ruthless, and audiences stayed away. With dismal box office returns and a rock-bottom critical score, any hope of a third installment disappeared, despite a small but persistent cult following that still refuses to let the idea die. Outside of that misstep, McCarthy appeared in The Joy Luck Club in 1993, playing Ted, the unfaithful husband to Rosalind Chow's character. It was a smaller but more grounded role, showing a different side of his range. By the time the 2000s arrived, his film career had largely faded. He pivoted to television, taking roles in made-for-TV movies and guest appearances on series like The Twilight Zone and Law & Order, SVU. His time in the procedural world was brief. Reports surfaced that he clashed with series regular Vincent D'Onofrio, and his behavior on set ultimately cost him the job. It was not the first time his temper had made headlines. Years earlier, he had been involved in a heated public confrontation with a journalist from The Observer who asked about the Brat Pack. McCarthy snapped, loudly insisting that it was never real. To him, the public wanted to believe in a tight, successful group that simply did not exist the way it was portrayed. Later, he landed a lead role in Kingdom Hospital, a surreal medical drama developed by Stephen King and inspired by a Lars von Trier series. The pilot drew solid reviews, but the audience vanished quickly. After just 13 episodes, ABC canceled the show. More projects followed, including appearances on E-Ring and Lipstick Jungle, but none of them stuck. By this point, McCarthy was no longer chasing stardom. He was surviving, rebuilding, and quietly searching for something that fit the man he had become rather than the image he once sold. The latest on Andrew McCarthy is tragic. For years, Andrew McCarthy stayed mostly quiet about his place in the Brat Pack. But now, decades later, he is finally speaking openly about what that label really meant to him. And the truth is simple. He hated it. The Brat Pack refers to a loose group of young actors who dominated 1980s pop culture. Names like Rob Lowe, Emilio Estevez, Demi Moore, Anthony Michael Hall, Judd Nelson, Molly Ringwald, Ali Sheedy, and McCarthy himself became inseparable in the public imagination. The term was coined in a 1985 New York Magazine cover story, meant as a clever nod to the Rat Pack of the 1960s. Nearly 40 years later, McCarthy has reflected on the experience in interviews, finally unpacking the weight that nickname carried. At the time, the rules were simple. If an actor appeared in films like St. Elmo's Fire or The Breakfast Club, they were automatically included. What sounded playful on paper quickly became something else entirely. Instead of elevating their careers, the label ended up complicating them. McCarthy has been clear about the personal fallout. He acknowledges that they were privileged and fortunate, but he rejects the idea that there was anything special or admirable about the group itself. In his view, they were simply in the right place at the right moment, riding a cultural wave that grew far bigger than any of them could control. And once that spotlight hit, they became easy targets. The rise of the Brat Pack marked a turning point in Hollywood. For decades, movies were designed primarily for adults. Youth-centered storytelling was not the norm. Then studios had a realization that changed everything. Teenagers and young adults went to the movies more often than anyone else, and suddenly, that audience became the priority. Before that shift, the industry was built around films like The Magnificent Seven, The French Connection, and The Godfather. The new wave of youth-driven movies disrupted that tradition, and not everyone welcomed the change. McCarthy has joked that the old guard looked at them like intruders, wondering who these young actors were and why they were suddenly running the industry. What makes it even stranger is how small the spark really was. One headline, one magazine, on shelves for a single week. Yet more than 3 decades later, its impact is still being felt. For McCarthy and his peers, the Brat Pack label created a deep sense of loss. They felt stripped of control over their own stories, boxed into an identity they never chose. Being branded that way carried stigma, and stigma follows you. The damage was real. Even though the group's chemistry on screen was undeniable, the label made working together feel risky. Instead of leaning into their shared success, they avoided it. One by one, they went their separate ways, doing whatever they could to escape the association. That single nickname cast a shadow far longer than anyone expected. And, for Andrew McCarthy, it remains a defining example of how quickly a moment of success can turn into something that lingers for a lifetime.